Walter Grady had eaten alone for over 15 years. In the quieter corners of Brooklyn, the ones tourists never found and locals forgot after dark, Walter was just another figure in the blur. He was part of the backdrop, hunched shoulders beneath a heavy military-style backpack, a faded green canvas relic with frayed straps and patches worn thin from time and memory. Most people barely noticed him. He didn't beg. He didn't shout or mutter. He didn't ask for anything. Every evening, just as the streetlights flickered on, Walter would make his way to the small cement bench tucked behind the community garden near Fulton Street. The bench wasn't much, but it was his. Sometimes he brought a stale roll, other times a bruised apple found at the bottom of a market crate. If he had nothing, he'd still sit there, dividing the silence into manageable portions. One half for grief. One half for memory. No one knew Walter Grady had once stood in sandstorms on the other side of the world, leading convoys through roads laced with danger. No one knew that he'd earned a Bronze Star for bravery during a supply mission gone wrong, when an enemy ambush set his truck aflame and 17 lives hung in the balance. Walter had driven the burning vehicle out of range, his hands blistered, his lungs full of smoke, and he hadn't thought twice. That moment didn't define him. What did, in his mind, was what came after. His wife Margaret had been the anchor. The reason he stayed grounded through deployments and loss. She wrote him letters every week, her script soft with curls, always ending the same way: "Come home safe." The coffee's still warm. But when Margaret fell sick in 2008, the VA misdiagnosed her cancer. By the time they realized, it was too late. She died in the hospital Walter trusted, and the system he believed in. After the funeral, Walter packed a single bag, sold their small apartment, and donated everything to a cancer foundation in her name. He never went back. Not to the VA. Not to friends. Not even to family. He became a ghost with dog tags, drifting between shelters and doorways, always careful not to overstay in any one place. Sometimes it's easier to be nobody than to be somebody who failed the person they loved most. He'd said it once to a soup kitchen volunteer. She had cried, but Walter didn't notice. He hadn't said it for sympathy. That morning in November, the sky was sharp and white. Snow threatened but hadn't yet fallen. Walter had walked nearly 3 miles by noon, returning bottles, checking dumpsters, and hoping for loose change near the laundromat. His breath came in visible clouds, and his fingers had stopped tingling an hour earlier, a bad sign. Hunger gnawed at him like something personal. It had been 3 days since he'd had anything more than watery soup. He passed Morelli's Corner Market 3 times before stepping inside. The bell chimed faintly, but no one turned. The store smelled of oranges and floor cleaner. His eyes landed on a rack of discounted baked goods near the register. There was a loaf of sourdough, wrapped in clear plastic, marked down to $1. Walter looked at it the way a drowning man looks at a rope. His hands trembled as he slipped the loaf into the inner pocket of his coat. He hadn't even zipped it before the voice came. "Hey! Stop right there." Mr. Morelli, the owner, had recently installed new security mirrors after a string of petty thefts. He saw everything. "I'm calling the cops," he shouted, grabbing the phone. Walter didn't move. He didn't run. He simply stood near the shelf, the loaf still visible in his half-zipped jacket. His body sagged from the weight of defeat more than the cold. "I just needed strength to live one more day," he said. 15 minutes later, 2 patrol officers pulled up. One was older, bored. The other, Officer Jenkins, was younger, still unsure about how the world worked. Jenkins spotted the tags around Walter's neck and gently examined a worn military ID. The plastic was faded, the ink nearly gone. "You really a vet?" Jenkins asked, his voice hesitant. Walter nodded once. "I used to be someone useful." "Not anymore." The older officer shook his head. "Store owners pressing charges. Says this isn't the first time." Walter didn't argue. There was nothing left to explain. The loaf sat in a brown evidence bag. He was cuffed quietly and placed in the back seat of the cruiser. At the precinct, he was processed alongside teenagers and drunks. His public defender met with him for 6 rushed minutes, scribbled a few notes, and explained the charge, misdemeanor theft. "We'll try for time served," he said, already checking the next file in his folder. His court date was set for the next morning. Walter spent the night in holding, seated on a cold bench beneath flickering lights. The other men in the cell talked and joked. Walter didn't. He slept in 15-minute bursts, waking at every sound. At dawn, he was led to Brooklyn Municipal Court. He hadn't shaved or changed clothes. His coat still smelled of stale bread. The courtroom was nearly empty. A clerk called the case. State versus Walter Grady. Walter stood. No one else did. No family waited in the gallery. No friends. Just 2 journalists watching for larger cases and a room full of strangers. Judge Michael Carmichael peered down from the bench. A stern man known for speed, he rarely looked up during minor arraignments. Loaf of bread. Prior incident. No fixed address, the prosecutor rattled off. We recommend holding the defendant until trial. No bail. Carmichael skimmed the file. Then he paused. Walter Edward Grady. The judge blinked. His fingers tightened around the paper. He looked at the defendant again. Walter Grady, he repeated under his breath. His gaze narrowed. Something flickered behind his eyes. "Mr. Grady, how do you plead?" he asked, his tone now less mechanical. "Guilty, Your Honor," Walter said. There was a murmur from the back. Someone stifled a laugh. Then something unexpected happened. Judge Carmichael stood. He rose slowly, as though pulled by an invisible string. The room fell silent. Even the court officers straightened in confusion. "I'm calling a recess," the judge said. 15 minutes. He looked directly at Walter. His voice, previously dry and official, now held a trace of something else. "The defendant will remain." Without another word, the judge walked out, leaving behind silence so thick it felt like snowfall. In his chambers, Carmichael shut the door and pulled open his desk drawer. Inside, protected in a plastic sleeve, was an old photo. A military unit. Desert sun. 12 soldiers, their faces younger, some already gone. In the top row stood a man with squared shoulders and haunted eyes, Staff Sergeant Walter Grady. He didn't need confirmation. But he opened his computer anyway. Pulled the military archive. 3 tours. 2 Bronze Stars. 1 specific mission in Fallujah, 2003. A burning convoy. An injured medic. Carmichael's own name listed in the report. It was Walter Grady who had carried him 2 miles under enemy fire. The man now arrested for stealing bread. Back in the courtroom, Walter waited, unaware of what the next minutes would bring. His life had long stopped expecting reversals. But outside the walls of the court, something had already begun to shift. Not with outrage, but with memory and quiet recognition. The courtroom remained in stillness, but something intangible had changed. Walter sat with the same posture he'd held through every winter wind and summer storm, slightly slouched, hands folded, eyes tired but not closed. He wasn't surprised by silence. It followed him like a familiar stray. What he didn't see was the way Officer Jenkins, still posted near the courtroom door, glanced nervously toward the judge's exit, or how the prosecutor was now flipping through his notes a little too quickly, sensing something was off. 15 minutes passed. When Judge Carmichael returned, his steps were different. Slower. He took his seat again, but he didn't pick up his gavel. Instead, he held the file, not like a judge reviewing paperwork, but like a man holding something too heavy for its weight. The clerk cleared his throat, expecting a continuation. The bailiff stood straighter. Carmichael looked at Walter for a long moment, then finally spoke. This court recognizes the defendant as Walter Edward Grady, he said, voice steady but stripped of its usual judicial coolness. United States Army, retired staff sergeant. 3 tours overseas. Decorated. Bronze Star recipient. A murmur ran through the benches. A woman in the back, a court reporter, paused her typing. The prosecutor opened his mouth to object, but the judge raised a hand. "Before we proceed," Carmichael said, "I'd like to read something into the record." From his bench, he unfolded a document, not court-issued. It was an official military mission report, yellowed at the edges. April 18, 2003, he began, a supply convoy in the outskirts of Fallujah was hit by enemy fire. Multiple vehicles disabled. Private First Class Michael Carmichael, severely injured, was pulled from a burning transport by Staff Sergeant Walter Grady. Carried for 2 miles to the evacuation zone under fire. The silence now was not passive, it was reverent. "That private first class was me," the judge added quietly. Walter didn't react. He simply bowed his head slightly, as if embarrassed by the attention. Carmichael turned to the prosecutor. "This man," he said, "should not be in jail for taking a loaf of bread. He should be being thanked." The young prosecutor cleared his throat, caught completely off guard. "Your Honor, regardless of past service, the law." "The law," Carmichael interrupted, "also considers context. A man with no criminal record prior to his decline. A man who served, who sacrificed. A man who lost his wife due to institutional neglect and has lived in silence ever since." He looked down at Walter again. "Theft?" "Yes." "Malicious intent?" "None." "Harm to the community?" "No." "Harm from the community?" "Perhaps." For the first time in hours, Walter shifted slightly in his seat. The judge turned back to the court. "This case is dismissed," he said. He paused. "Mr. Grady, you are free to go." The bailiff stepped forward, uncertain. Walter didn't rise. Then Carmichael did something no one expected. He descended from the bench. In his black robes, in front of the entire room, he walked to where Walter sat. For a moment, the only sound was the soft creak of the judge's shoes on the tile floor. Then, in full view of the courtroom, Judge Carmichael extended his hand. Walter looked at it, unsure. The judge whispered, almost too soft to hear, "I never forgot. You saved me. Now let me return it." Walter stood slowly. The 2 men shook hands. Not like strangers, not like judge and defendant, but like men who'd once been buried under the same sky and carried the same weight. Reporters who had been waiting for more sensational cases quickly raised their cameras. One snapped a photo that would be printed in papers across the city by the next morning, a veteran once forgotten, being lifted not by charity, but by truth. That photo traveled. Within hours, it appeared on social media. Veterans groups reposted it. A journalist from a national paper picked it up. They titled the piece, "A Loaf of Bread and the Weight of Silence." By the next evening, someone left a note at Walter's usual bench near the community garden. It simply said, "You are not alone. Thank you for your service." Taped to it was a grocery store gift card. The next morning, there were 5 more. Then 12. A city councilwoman reached out with an invitation. A local shelter, after learning his story, offered him housing. The VA, under pressure from press and public, reactivated Walter's case file. When Officer Jenkins visited him days later to check in, Walter had just finished helping the shelter staff organize donated winter coats. He still wore the same backpack. Still folded his bread in careful halves. But his eyes had changed. People had started greeting him by name again. And yet, through all of it, Walter asked for nothing. No recognition, no parade. Just a thermos of coffee and a bench near the garden. Sometimes he sat alone. Sometimes strangers sat with him. But from that day forward, no one forgot the man with the bread and the silence. A man who had once believed kindness had left the world, only to find it quietly waiting for the moment it was needed most. The bench near the community garden changed after that day. It still bore the cracks from years of weather, the rusted bolts, the faint initials carved by teenagers long gone, but now, it held more than a man. It held a story. People slowed down when they passed. Some sat, quietly, and left behind folded notes. Others left sandwiches, knit scarves, or thermoses filled with tea. Walter never touched the offerings unless there was someone else nearby who needed them more. He didn't consider himself a symbol. He barely considered himself worthy. When asked about the courtroom moment, he'd only shrug. He hadn't expected to be remembered, especially not by the very man whose life he'd once carried across a smoking desert. Still, word spread. The city council hosted a community forum, its usual folding chairs suddenly packed with attendees. Judge Carmichael sat in the front row, in civilian clothes, and gave a speech not about justice but about responsibility. He spoke about how systems fail in silence, how men like Walter fall through cracks because we assume someone else is watching. But sometimes, there's no one watching, just one man, one day, choosing to take one loaf of bread. The mayor stood afterward, hesitated, and made an announcement. Brooklyn would fund a pilot program, not a shelter, but something different. A workshop, SK*LL building space for veterans dealing with housing insecurity, PTSD, and reintegration. Not for counseling, not for paperwork, but for work with hands. Carpentry. Repairs. Fixing bikes. Building furniture from discarded wood. Quiet labor for quiet men. And they had a name already. The Grady Bench Project. Walter didn't attend the first meeting. He wasn't used to meetings. But Officer Jenkins found him a week later. "Sir," Jenkins said, awkwardly, holding a folder like a student with overdue homework. "They'd like you to teach. Just a few mornings a week. You wouldn't have to say much. Just show people how you do what you do." Walter considered it. He thought about his days collecting discarded wires, about how he'd once built a lamp from a broken toaster and a bicycle reflector. He thought about his father's workbench back in Ohio, how the man used to say, "If your hands are steady, your mind follows." So Walter said yes. The project opened in a long-abandoned auto garage, its sign half burned out. Volunteers cleaned it, painted it, and laid down thick mats to keep the winter cold from seeping through the floor. They stocked it with donated tools, stripped furniture, half-functional machines, and patience. There was no check-in sheet. No required speech. Just a long wooden table, a pot of coffee, and a bin labeled "Try fixing this." Walter arrived on the first day wearing the same coat, same boots, same backpack. He didn't give a speech. He simply picked up a cracked chair, ran his hand along the spine, and began sanding. By the third week, 5 other men had joined. One had done plumbing before addiction stole his license. One had painted murals before a divorce left him sleeping in his van. One had just returned from overseas, too quiet to speak but always there when the door opened. Walter said little. He pointed. He demonstrated. When someone made a mistake, he fixed it beside them, never instead of them. Every day, he brought a loaf of bread. Sometimes sliced. Sometimes not. And he'd leave half of it in the break area before starting work. No explanation. A volunteer from the mayor's office noticed. "We should serve full meals," she said at the next meeting. "If they're hungry, they won't focus." But one of the workshop participants spoke up. His voice shook from nerves. "They're not hungry," he said. "They're waiting to see if Walter eats first." The bread became a ritual. A reminder that even in the quietest spaces, there could be generosity without pride. 3 months in, someone pinned a photo to the garage wall. It was a still from the courtroom, the moment Judge Carmichael extended his hand. Next to it, someone taped a quote written in marker. "Sometimes, kindness is just knowing who to listen to before they ask." People came and went. Some stayed. Some relapsed. Some disappeared. But every week, the Grady Bench Project added something new: a shelf, a lamp, a repaired heater, a fixed bicycle for a neighborhood kid. The city noticed. Funding expanded. Volunteers increased. Walter didn't change his pace. He still arrived early. Still left late. He sanded wood and rewired lamps, nodding quietly when someone got it right. And when someone got it wrong, he simply showed them again. One morning, a young woman entered with a notebook in her hand. She looked nervous, out of place. Her name was Elena. She was a reporter, not from the city, but from a national publication. She asked if she could observe, maybe do a piece. Walter hesitated, but agreed. She visited for a week. She didn't ask intrusive questions. Just sat, took notes, helped sweep. One morning, she asked him why he kept coming back. Walter thought for a long time. Then he said, "Because I know what it's like when no one sees you. And I know what it feels like when they finally do." Her article, when it ran, began with a simple headline: "The Man Who Fixed More Than Furniture." It was shared thousands of times. Across the country, city councils began inquiring about the Grady Bench model. Walter's name appeared in speeches. A plaque was unveiled outside the workshop. Walter came to see it on a quiet evening. The sun was setting. The plaque read, "In honor of Walter E. Grady, who proved that a single quiet act of dignity can rebuild what a system has forgotten." He stared at it for a while. Then, he unwrapped a fresh loaf of bread. Broke it in half. Left one piece on the bench beside the plaque. And ate the other in silence. The workshop became something the city hadn't expected. It wasn't just the projects, the fixed lamps, the sanded chairs, the shelves made from reclaimed wood. It was the atmosphere. The way silence lived comfortably in that space. The way people entered one way, guarded, brittle, and after days or weeks of small failures and shared bread, they began to stand straighter. No one was asked to explain their past. No one was asked to prove their worth. All they were asked was, "What can your hand still do?" Walter continued his quiet routine. He never took a leadership role in name. But everyone followed his example. He arrived early, unlocked the doors, brewed the coffee, and sat at the table with a folded rag and a chipped mug. The ritual mattered. Every morning, he unwrapped a loaf of bread. Cut it. Half for others. Half for himself. No one dared take the first piece before he did. One icy morning, a young man arrived. New face. Nervous hands. His name was Corey, just out of the service, eyes scanning like he was still on patrol. He didn't speak at first. Just watched. Walter didn't press. He handed Corey a small project, a desk drawer with a broken track. Corey worked in silence. And when the drawer slid in smoothly for the first time, he smiled, just barely. Walter saw it. From then on, Corey came every day. Others did too. The workshop expanded. The mayor's office offered a second location. Judge Carmichael came to visit, not in robes, but in jeans, with sleeves rolled and hands ready to help. He didn't speak much that day either. He simply stood beside Walter, hammering nails into a donated bookcase. More volunteers arrived, retired engineers, widowed grandfathers, young adults who wanted to feel useful. A group of teenagers began showing up after school. One of them asked Walter how to rewire a lamp. Walter showed them, patiently, without flourish. The teenager returned a week later with 2 more friends. By spring, the Grady Bench Project had a waiting list. Then came the call from the Department of Veterans Affairs. They wanted to replicate the program in other cities. They offered Walter a formal position: coordinator, instructor, public liaison. It came with a title, a salary, and a platform. Walter sat with the letter for a long time. He didn't answer immediately. He read it twice, then folded it and placed it inside his backpack, beside the dog tags and an old photo of Margaret. That night, he sat on his usual bench. broke his bread in half, left one piece beside him. The next morning, he returned to the workshop and quietly added a new tool to the shelf, a leather-bound notebook labeled Lessons to Keep. On the first page, he wrote, "Teach without pride. Build without noise. Give more than you take." He accepted the position. But only on one condition: the program must always begin with a meal. A loaf, a pot of coffee, anything warm and simple, placed on the table before any work began. No schedules. No hierarchy. Just bread and tools. In time, the program spread, from Brooklyn to Newark, then to Atlanta, Denver, Milwaukee. Each new center opened with a shared ritual: a wooden bench at the entrance, a small plaque, and a warm loaf of bread waiting in the break room. Walter never sought the spotlight. When news crews came, he stepped out of the frame. When reporters called, he often redirected them to others. He believed his work wasn't about his story, but about all the stories like his that were never told. But one afternoon, a boy approached the bench near the original workshop. 11 years old. Skinny arms. Holding a laminated card, his father's service photo. "Is this the place that helps people like my dad?" he asked. Walter nodded once and motioned him inside. The boy returned the next week. And the one after. Eventually, he started fixing old radios, carefully tuning the frequencies until they buzzed to life. He said it made him feel closer to his father, who had been lost to suicide 2 years earlier. One day, the boy brought a gift. A drawing, a bench, a loaf of bread, and a man with a silver beard. Walter folded the drawing and placed it in his backpack. He didn't need words. Years later, when Walter passed, it wasn't loud. There were no parades. No breaking headlines. But on the day the news spread quietly through the neighborhoods of Brooklyn, every Grady bench across the country held a moment of stillness. In each workshop, people laid out a loaf of bread, a cup of black coffee, and a folded rag, just as Walter would have. The mayor of Brooklyn gave a short speech. Judge Carmichael placed a photograph on the original bench. Officer Jenkins, now a lieutenant, ordered a custom military coin with Walter's initials engraved. And Corey, the once nervous young man, now ran the workshop. He taught without speaking too much. He made sure no one ever left hungry. And every morning, he cut the bread in half. Just like Walter had. The city renamed the street where the first workshop stood Grady Way. There was no ceremony. Just a new signpost. And a bench beneath it. Because one quiet man, armed only with a loaf of bread and the memory of who he once was, had rebuilt not just furniture, but the fabric of a forgotten community. Kindness without question is enough.